The Molasses Tsunami, January 15, 1919. A steel tank burst in downtown Boston and sent molasses through the streets in a wave nearly 25 feet high, moving at 35 miles per hour. 21 people died. The tank had been leaking for years. Children in the neighborhood collected molasses off the ground at its base. Nobody fixed it. The company painted the exterior brown to hide the staining. That was their fix. In 1915, USIA built a 90-foot wide, 50-foot tall molasses tank on Commercial Street in Boston's North End, a densely packed Italian immigrant neighborhood where narrow streets ran between row houses built wall to wall. The tank held 2-3 million gallons of molasses distilled into ethanol for wartime munitions. Construction was supervised by Arthur Gell, USIA's treasurer, not an engineer. The tank leaked from the start. Neighbors on Commercial Street treated it as a convenience, collecting seeping molasses from the base in small containers. This was not a crisis. It was routine. Trial testimony describes workers painting the tank's exterior brown, not to maintain the steel, but to hide the staining that showed up on the street. The company chose concealment over repair. Arthur Gell had no engineering training. The tank he supervised was too thin for its scale, stressed at every seam. The leaking wasn't a maintenance problem. It was designed in. USIA operated that tank for years, pumping millions of gallons of industrial molasses into a structure it knew was failing. No repair, no escalation, just the brown paint holding the secret. 2 days before the collapse, USIA loaded a fresh shipment of raw molasses into the tank. By January 13, it sat near maximum capacity. January 15 brought an unusual temperature swing, bitter cold giving way to roughly 40 degrees F. The warming may have accelerated fermentation inside the tank, building carbon dioxide pressure. Evidence suggests temperature was a contributing factor. Structural failure was the primary cause. At approximately 12:30 p.m., rivets began shooting out of the tank walls. Witnesses blocks away described the sound as machine gun fire. Then the wall split open. Molasses surged through the north end in a wave 15 to 25 feet high, moving it up to 35 miles per hour. The wave demolished a section of the Boston Elevated Railway steel trestle. The north end's narrow streets and row buildings left no room to run. 21 people were killed in the disaster. Approximately 150 were injured. USIA's first response was deflection. Company officials blamed an anarchist bomb, a claim calculated to exploit public fear of radical violence in 1919. Courts rejected it entirely. Over 100 plaintiffs brought civil suits. Massachusetts courts had no template for a case this large. It became one of the most complex civil actions in the state's history. A special auditor, Hugh Ogden, spent roughly 3 years reviewing thousands of pages of testimony. Accountability moved slowly. In 1925, Ogden ruled against USIA. The company paid approximately $600,000 in civil settlements. The anarchist defense had failed. Negligent construction had a price. The disaster also drove reform. Evidence suggests it contributed to building inspection and engineering permit requirements in Massachusetts, exposing how major structures could rise with no qualified oversight. The temperature swing on January 15th is part of the story, but only part. Most engineering analyses treat structural underdesign as the primary cause. The warming may have contributed, but it did not explain the failure on its own. The disaster's influence on building codes is real, but harder to trace than it first appears. A direct line from this flood to specific new statutes has not been fully drawn in the record. The tank failed because USIA built it without a qualified engineer, then painted over the leaks instead of fixing them. Concealment cost less than repair. USIA blamed anarchists, a convenient deflection in a fearful era. Special Auditor Hugh Ogden spent 3 years reviewing testimony and rejected that claim. Wartime reputation was not a legal shield. USIA paid roughly $600,000 in settlements. The disaster pushed Boston and Massachusetts toward building inspection reforms. The community that had lived in the shadow of that tank had